Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. It is Thursdays with Friends, episode 26. Pretty incredible how resilient this community has shown to be this year. 26 episodes, and so good to see all of your faces. Thursdays with Friends is our online conversation on current issues. We often use the slogan here at FCNL, war is not the answer. And if war is not the answer, then what is? This critical question is especially important considering the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, the blockade in Yemen, the coup d'etat in Myanmar, so many different issues around the world. I'm the show's producer, Wesley Wolfbear Pinkham, and here's our chat host for Thursdays with Friends, FCNL General Secretary Diane Randall, and her guest, Shukria Dellawar, FCNL's lobbyist and coordinator of the Prevention and Protection Working Group. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you, Wesley, and welcome everyone to this episode of Thursdays with Friends. It's really Thursday. This is one of my favorite parts of my job right now, is to host this event and to introduce you to really wonderful colleagues at FCNL, and in some cases colleagues outside of FCNL who we work with closely. And today we have a real treat to hear from Shukria Dellawar. I know that many of the people on this call are peace builders. You have cared about peace for much of your lives and worked on it. And I can tell you that Shukria has the heart and soul of a peace builder. And you're going to hear some of the specific work that she's helping lead with a whole coalition of others. But before we start the conversation, I want to turn to my gratitude to all of you for always your financial support for FCNL, your prayers, your good intentions, and your advocacy. And specifically, we are really marking the fact that there is now a commitment to withdraw US troops from Afghanistan. And many of you have helped advocate for that. We have written about that, where there's some policy briefs on it on our website, and we hope that you'll take a look at those. Those are also work that Shukria has contributed to. So, as Wesley said, many of you have been involved with FCNL since we've had the War is Not the Answer campaign. And back before I started working at FCNL, we began looking at the prevention of deadly conflict, and which had been discussed in policy circles since the 1990s. But it was the 1998 Carnegie Committee on the Prevention of Deadly Conflict that helped really clearly articulate the concept. And that was followed by a United Nations report 3 years later. This called for a shift in thinking from a military first strategy to one that would be grounded in prevention and protection of civilians. Preventing war and violent conflict is less costly and, of course, can be much more effective than responding to violent outbreaks. As a Quake organization working for policies to create and build peace, FCNL responded by helping establish a coalition of what started with a handful of organizations and now includes about 250 NGOs, that is non-governmental organizations, from faith groups, human rights organizations, anti-genocide groups, aid agencies, and also local NGOs that are working on the ground in situations of violent conflict to help prevent it. This is the Prevention and Protection Working Group, which FCNL convenes to advocate both with the administration and Congress to improve US government policies. The advocacy is highly focused with key people in the administration and key committees on the Hill. Often the education and advocacy is done quietly. Both the breadth of groups participating in the Prevention and Protection Working Group and this focus makes this coalition very effective and trusted. Our guest, as I said, is Shukria Dellawar, our lead lobbyist on preventing violent conflict and the coordinator of the Prevention and Protection Working Group. Now, let me just say an aside, you're going to hear Shukria and me refer to PPWG, and that is the Prevention and Protection Working Group. And I'll just tell you that this field has more acronyms than almost any field I've worked in at FCNL. So if we throw one out, put in, and you don't understand what we're saying, put a question in the chat, because we want to make sure that you can understand the breadth of what we're talking about. Before Shukria joined FCNL, she worked at the Center for International Policy, where she led the center's Afghanistan study group. As a peace and security expert, she has testified before Congress and in several briefings supporting peacebuilding measures to end the conflict in Afghanistan. She is an ardent advocate for the empowerment of women and their meaningful inclusion in peace negotiations. Shukria received her bachelor's and master's degrees from George Mason University's Carter Center in Conflict Analysis and Resolution. Welcome, Shukria. We're so happy to have you here. And I'll just let you, before we start in with questions, let me just offer you a chance to say hello and any sort of opening remarks you want to make.
Sure. Thank you for that kind introduction, Diane. And thanks also to all our donors and supporters for making our work on atrocity prevention and peace building possible. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Good. Well, one of the legislative, as I said, this is work that engages key agencies, key federal agencies, and we're going to talk about some of that. But let's start with legislation, because there are people on this call who helped advocate for what became the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Prevention Act, which passed a couple of years ago. And I just want to thank all of you for your advocacy, because that was significant when that legislation passed with bipartisan support. It took almost 10 years to get this bill passed by Congress. And I'm going to ask you, Shukria, to talk just a little bit about what's in that legislation that passed and how it's affecting the work of the Prevention and Protection Working Group.
Sure. Thanks, Diane. So the main thing about the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act, when it passes, that bipartisan support, the Congress agreed that there is a sense of Congress that it's in the national security interest of the United States to prevent atrocities around the world. And with that, it is a sense of Congress. It's not codified, so they don't have to, but it's definitely what they aspire to do. And what was mandatory in the bill is the training of Foreign Service officers around missions across the world to make sure they understand the atrocity early warning risks, and they report back to Washington so that before a genocide actually occurs, the US government is able to put together a whole of government approach and respond to prevent such deadly conflict. And I'll stop there.
So I know that this has been interesting to watch, because this bill does require some implementation, and this Prevention and Protection Working Group is focusing a little bit on that. And I think you've actually established a framework for how you're engaging with government. And I know people may remember that early when we were working earlier, I'd say like about 6 years ago or so, when we were working on this legislation, President Obama had created an atrocities prevention board to try to do a kind of an early warning of atrocities that might be coming. Can you talk about how that has changed over the last few years, and what's the role of this legislation in relation to trying to pay attention to atrocities that may be happening, and what the US government can do to try to prevent those?
Sure. So the Atrocity Prevention Board, which was established under the Biden administration, which also PPWG have heavily pushed for, was renamed under the Trump administration as the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force. It's currently headed out of the State Department. After the passage of the Elie Wiesel Act in 2019, the coalition, especially in the last 2 years, has heavily focused on the implementation of the legislation. So with that, we have engaged with several government agencies, including National Security Council, USAID, State Department, and several other agencies, including the Defense Department. But more particularly over the last 2 years, we established 2 subcommittees to really focus on how best to implement this legislation. One subcommittee is focused on specifically Elie Wiesel's implementation and responding with recommendations on an annual basis, sometimes on a quarterly basis, to the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force as they get their mandated reports out to Congress. And the second subcommittee is focused on conflict-specific advocacy. And over the course of the last 2 years, we flagged several conflicts for that subcommittee and focused on country assessments and raised the visibility of early warning risks for genocide, and the administration has really taken those assessments very seriously and has responded and stays engaged with PPWG on that front.
One of the things that I'm impressed about when I hear you talk about this is the breadth of this coalition and having so many members that in some cases have direct experience in countries where there is a risk of atrocities or genocide, are able to provide information to the US government for this risk assessment. Can you indicate what some of those might be? I mean, what are some of the warnings that are provided? And then, I mean, I know that the government doesn't share everything with the civil society. They do use this information, but can you talk a little bit about how that actually works? Like if you have a group of people and some of the countries where you have done these risk assessments, some of the spaces where you're doing that.
Sure. So I'll start with some of the members. I mean, we have 250 plus members. So obviously I won't talk about all the members, but let me at least just name a few members. So we work very closely with Search for Common Ground, Alliance for Peacebuilding, Mercy Corps, the Dangerous Speech Project, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Win Without War, American Bar Association, American Society for International Law, Human Rights Watch, Never Again Coalition, and universities such as George Mason University. And what we do with those assessments is we make sure that some of our members have ground presence before we even choose to do a conflict or a country assessment. So in the last 2 years, we have done assessments on Kashmir, on Sri Lanka, on Burma, Myanmar, Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, Colombia. And in each case, we have made sure that PPWG members have a presence on the ground. They're tuned into local peace builders. We are making sure we're weaving the local peace builder perspectives in these conflict assessments. To me, that's so critical, having worked on Afghanistan for over 14 years, that, you know, if you're not hearing from the ground, you're going to get some of those recommendations wrong. So PPWG members are very, very responsible in that respect. And that's mainly why the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force also says that our assessments are critical, because they see added civil society value that other orgs are not able to provide.
Diane, you're muted here.
Sorry. The Elie Wiesel Act passed at the end of 2018. Is that correct? And President Trump signed it into law? In
January 14, 2019.
2019, yeah. So this was, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the bipartisan support that the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act had, and what, and you know, the fact that that President Trump signed it into law. What happened? You know, what's different between that administration and this administration? And I just want to note that some people will remember, people who come to FCNL's annual meeting will recall that we gave Representative Ann Wagner our Ed Snyder Award, I believe it was then in 2019, for her work and her leadership on helping move this, her sponsorship in helping move this legislation forward. So tell us a little bit about what happened during the Trump administration and how has that changed in the Biden administration?
Sure. So, I mean, the good thing is the Trump administration signed the legislation into law. But one of the things that happened with the National Security Council during the Trump administration is they changed the Atrocity Prevention Board's name to the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force. Part of the reason was that they felt that we can't always prevent atrocities, so we don't want prevention in the name. Nevertheless, I will say that the mid-level leadership, and especially the functional officers across the different government agencies, have been very, very responsible, have been tuned in. I feel like they held the fort in a very difficult time, and continue to work with our coalition and make sure that they were implementing the legislation as best they can, given some issues with upper leadership. The change we've seen with Biden administration taking over is there's definitely more interactive. I mean, I don't normally have to ask for meetings anymore. They actually reach out and they'll ask for, hey, you know, do you have some information on this specific conflict, or can we have a discussion or a consultation soon? And, you know, the Elie Wiesel report's coming out. So you definitely are feeling more more interactive and not so much like requests being answered. The other thing is many colleagues, many US government colleagues worked really hard in the last 2 years to do whatever they can in their capacity within different government agencies. And we've had several consultations. Different government agencies do come to PPWG's monthly meetings, so they give us updates on what each government agency is doing in terms of prevention and programming across the world. A lot of these conversations remain off the record, so I can't really go in details, but the fact is that those really strong relationships are established and we're really able to be effective in that front.
It seems like the virtual meeting space has allowed a pretty broad participation and regular participation. And again, part of that you are doing in your role as the coordinator of this Prevention and Protection Working Group is setting these monthly meetings. And it is fascinating to hear the variety of agencies that have participate, the variety of federal agencies that participate. Obviously we would expect state and USAID and the National Security Council, but I think you've mentioned that you've had the CIA and obviously Department of Defense is participating in some of them, and it's very powerful to recognize that these NGOs are being listened to, and particularly the people who are directly involved on the ground are being listened to as well. So I want to talk. We're starting to get questions, and I want to invite questions into the box. There's so many different areas and potential places of conflict. And Shukria tracks a lot of these. Some of them she probably has greater expertise on. I also just want to note that, as always, we do try to include a legislative ask in what we're doing, and we will be putting one up related to Yemen, which is one of the areas that the Prevention and Protection Working Group is looking at. Do you want to talk just a little bit about the Yemen conflict and what you have identified with regard to Yemen and how that's affecting the FCNL advocacy?
Sure. So very recently, in February, actually, we had a consultation with the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force, and both the Somalia and the Yemen conflicts were highlighted. And we actually had another lobbyist from FCNL, I'm sure many of you might know, Hassan Al-Tayyab, presented on that conflict. But along with him, we had Aisha Juman, who is a Yemeni American expert on the conflict, and two other ground advocates that were brought into that closed door briefing. And so they presented the information to the task force. And, weeks later, of course, we heard about the Biden administration's announcement that the US will stop the offensive support for the Saudi war in Yemen. Also, USAID unfreeze some of the humanitarian aid. And of course, our current ask remains to lift the blockade. And that's something that PPWG and FCNL is pushing on. So we had great success in that particular conflict. I'm really happy. And I know FCNL is very happy on that front as well.
This has been a real priority for us, and we're grateful to be working in partnership with so many different organizations on this. Stephen has put the ask in the chat, which is to, as Shukria noted, to end the blockade in Yemen. There's some questions coming in about Afghanistan. I want you to take those. Before we do that, can we turn to what the role is that PPWG plays with Congress? Because it isn't like a lot of the other issues that FCNL works on where we're broadly engaging everyone. And yet there are particular areas we do engage Congress. And one of them is around appropriations. And some people may remember that, have heard about the Complex Crises Fund or the Atrocity Prevention Fund. If you could just talk briefly about what is that money used for, and what do we need, and what are we asking for? Anything you can share about that?
Sure. So the Complex Crises Fund is actually a fund that the PPWG is the only organization that has always pushed for it. It was established because of FCNL and PPWG, and we continue to be the only organization really pushing for that fund. It's a fund that's been appropriated for $30 million for FY22. We're asking for that fund to be appropriated at $60 million. The reason for that is because so many other conflicts have broken out and worsened under the pandemic. So we definitely want to, ask for more and make sure that this emergency aid is sent wherever it's needed. The good thing with the Complex Crises Fund is it acts much faster and cuts through bureaucracy. So it's not like the other peace building and conflict prevention funds. The other fund that we have asked for more, which is appropriated currently at 5 million, is the Atrocity Prevention Fund. We have asked this year specifically for FY22 for 25 million. And again, it's for the same reasoning, because many more conflicts have broken out. If you look at the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia and the Burma-Myanmar conflict definitely worsened. And there's so many other conflicts, that's just to name a few, but the pandemic has exasperated the situation on the ground for many populations. So that's the reason we're asking for those scaling up of those funds.
Will you talk a little bit about Burma and Myanmar and what PPWG is doing, and specifically what we all could be paying attention to in terms of thinking about this terrible tragedy that's happening there?
Sure, thanks for asking, Diane. I mean, that's been a very difficult conflict, I would say, for the entire prevention and protection working group. And I say that because before I even took this job, that conflict was flagged by my predecessors. And then when I took this job for the last 2 years, I have flagged that conflict at least 3 times to the administration. And very recently, when the Myanmar coup happened and the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi was taken down, obviously, many people have protested inside Myanmar. And over the last several months, it's been really heartbreaking to see that nearly 700 unarmed people have been killed, 40 of them children. And about 3,000, almost 3,300 have been imprisoned. So it's difficult when you have flagged the conflict several times and we haven't quite seen the response. But I will say, just in the last month, because we have had that history of flagging that particular conflict, I had reached out to the National Security Council. They did give me an emergency meeting. We pulled in all the PPWG members that have been very active on that conflict, including some experts from the ground, and they briefed the National Security Council. We also had colleagues from USAID and State Department on that call. And then they gave us some information, which I can't go into too much. Again, it's off the record conversations, but they did assure us of some of the punitive measures they were taking to make sure they curtail the military in Myanmar. So again, that's something that's now making progress. I will say that at the Hill also, a genocide determination for the Rohingya is being pushed. So there's simultaneous efforts both with the executive and legislative branch.
And if a genocide determination is made, what happens?
I think, first, I think it will take a while because they just reintroduced, I would say last week, specifically I'm trying to get that legislation name, and it's skipping me right now, so forgive me.
Okay.
But it is the Genocide Determination Act for Burma, Myanmar, and specifically it's talking about the Rohingya genocide that happened and continues to happen. So when that's made, I think that there's been a global effort to contain the situation and much more resources go to that conflict. But I think it's a process that takes time, many reasons.
Yeah. Let me ask that we're getting questions about Afghanistan. People know you have a lot of background and expertise in that area. Specifically, one question just broadly, should we be pulling out of Afghanistan? Should the US be withdrawing? And what protections then are in place specifically for women and girls in terms of the what's changed there in the last decade and what to expect? You can talk about that briefly.
Sure, thanks, Diane. That again is another one of those really difficult conflicts where at least FCNL from the get-go has been against that war, and it's good that the decision has been made and that there is a timeline for withdrawal. What's been difficult is there was never a focus on peace in that conflict. That focus came quite late, I would say, at the 11th hour, and it's really hard to fix things at that point. Definitely, I've been in touch with women activists on the ground, and the good thing is that Secretary Blinken has said that even though we're withdrawing, we are going to try to do what we can with aid and humanitarian aid and development to make sure we continue supporting women. But I think the thing is that the focus really at this point has to be on peace building measures and strengthening regional cooperation. And of course, the civil war will get worsened. That's the reality on the ground. But we couldn't stay there forever. We should have left striking peace. That we missed many markers for that. At this point, it's more about accepting reality and doing the best we can to prevent further escalation of conflict.
One of the aspects of the Prevention and Protection Working Group that I think is so true is that every one of these conflicts has its own set of structure to it, and always, if a conflict can be prevented and peace building measures can be done to avert that, it is much better than trying to extricate ourselves from war and from conflict once it starts. And so that clearly is a lot of what the focus of this work is trying to do. And it is big and broad, and I'm so grateful that FCNL is able to play a coordination role of this very broad coalition with this broad group. We had a question at the very beginning from Rich Van Dellen, who was asked, is the Nonviolent Peace Force part of PPWG?
Yes, it's an active member. They're very engaged, definitely a member.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's a big group, and it's grown tremendously, and it's actually very encouraging to see both the academic and the on-the-ground resources for peace building and conflict prevention. And we know that our policymakers have some work to catch up. So as you know, all of FCNL's work is really focused on not all, but a significant portion of our work is focused on trying to address militarism and trying to address making that change that pivots from war and conflict to multilateralism, diplomacy, peace building, and effective development aid. And this program is one part of that. Shukria, we could probably talk to you for hours, but we're coming to the close of our time. What do you have any final remarks you'd like to make to the group of people who are participating today?
Sure. First, thank you, Diane. And of course, it was wonderful to be your guest today. Also, a huge thanks to our advocates and donors who have joined us today. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I know it's difficult in these days to listen to more and more about conflict. I also really want to thank Humanity United for their continued and ongoing support to the Prevention and Protection Working Group. And I really end with this thought that for far too long, we have failed to address root causes of conflict and ended up in many wars, and many American soldiers have been killed. A lot of civilians around the world have been killed, and we have wasted a lot of tax dollars. And it's time for our government to prioritize prevention and addressing root causes of conflict, which costs us much less and saves many more lives, both here and abroad. Thanks.
Thank you, Shukria. You said that elegantly, that the priorities that we make as a government and our ability to try to influence those is absolutely central to the work of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. And we're really grateful for our ability to partner with the funder, Humanity United, which gives us a grant to support this work, but also with all of the people on this call who, again, give us financial support for the broad work of FCNL and who are just 100% behind this effort to try to realign those priorities. So we're very grateful. It's just I get excited when I get to talk to staff because I don't always get the in-depth knowledge, and so it's wonderful to share Shukria's background and passion with you. Just a reminder that the next Thursdays with Friends is not 2 weeks, it's actually 3 weeks because we do the second and fourth Thursday. So on May 13th, I'll be joined by the Reverend Adam Taylor, and he is the president and CEO of Sojourners, taking over after Jem Wallace, who some of you know had been there for a very long time. And it has been our delight at FCNL to work closely with Adam in a number of ways on a variety of issues. And so I think you'll find it really delightful to talk to Adam, who leads a very powerful colleague organization, and they do a lot of publication and magazine and whatnot. So I hope that you'll all join us in 3 weeks on May 13th. And again, thank you, Shukria, and thank you to all the peace builders who are part of this work.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, everyone.